Hello guys, welcome to my channel. It's the Caribbean Bookworm, and in this video I will be giving you a book review for Higgs, written by Jim Baggott. If you're new to my channel, this is a booktube channel, of course, as you can see from the videos I've posted. I typically do book reviews on the genres of horror, science fiction, fantasy, and some non-fiction reads, such as I'm doing today with the book Higgs. If you're curious about seeing more bookish content or more sciencey content, as I occasionally tend to post some science and math content as well, feel free to hit the subscribe button down below and hit the bell notification so that every time that a new video is uploaded, you can click and tune in to see the lovely new content that I have for you. Without further ado, let's delve into the book Higgs. This book caught me by surprise in the best way possible. This turned out to be a surprisingly engaging read. As if you've seen my TBR videos before, I've mentioned that I was reading it and that this book turned out to be a very light read. Now, I think I have to paraphrase and kind of reformulate that sentence. This book, it's not an easy book to read, and that I will dive into that aspect when I talk about the cons I have with the book, which isn't that many to be quite frank. But it isn't a light read, but it's still within, I'd say, the popular science genre in some regard. I would say that this book did what The Elegant Universe did for me when I was younger, but this book did that in a manner in which I'm more, you could say, mature in terms of thinking about science and such. And it did so in a more like hard, empirical, and historical narrative type of way. So I've said a lot of things without mentioning what the book is specifically about. The book is in essence about the history of the discovery of the Higgs boson, a subatomic particle that has been confirmed to exist back in 2012. And this particle was one of the last missing pieces of the standard model of particle physics in order to have this complete framework, you could say, of having a picture as to how our universe is essentially built out of. And the standard model of particle physics is, you can think of it as the periodic table for subatomic particles that came about due to a theory in physics known as quantum field theory. And the book is in essence divided into two parts, and the first part being the more theoretical framework and how a lot of theorists came to actually developing this model and actually the specific thing that was needed to include the Higgs field within the standard model of particle physics. And the second part of the book is about the more experimental aspect of things, how the experiments were built and how the government invested money and how different countries and such were trying to race towards the discovery of the Higgs boson. Without further ado, let's delve into the pros of this book. First of all, one of my major pros of this book is the writing fashion, the way of which Jim Baggott wrote this book. It has a very engaging historical account of things that are happening. Like, the book is not only about the theoretical and the experimental and the science in essence behind the discovery of the Higgs particle, but it was also about the actual individuals that were going about these discoveries and their actual lives and struggles and things that were happening in essence in the background. Some names were mentioned that if you're into physics, you might find them familiar, such as Oppenheimer, Richard Feynman, Weinberg, Fermi, and all of these different scientists. And so other names were mentioned that were a little bit more niche, that well, they weren't quite as obvious. My second pro with this book has to do with my first pro, but I have to mention this on its own, and that is that the author does not shy away to dive into some jargon. This book, hence why the point which I mentioned beforehand was that even though I found this book to be a light read, that isn't to say that the book is necessarily a very easy read. The book basically requires you to be a little bit comfortable with some physics jargon, especially things related to quantum mechanics, as even though he very cleverly introduces these things, he still doesn't, of course, spend too much time on them, since he wants to get a point across to get towards the or to get towards the point in which he can actually talk about, well, developments made in quantum field theory. So if you're someone that, say, when you read a popular science book, you wish that every detail is cleverly explained and don't like to do some background research on your own time, so say Google stuff or look up YouTube videos, then this might be quite a challenging read, because a lot of times it requires you to actually dive into things on your own, especially if you want to really understand what he's talking about, or you'd have to sacrifice and take some of the things to heart, basically, and not worry too much about them, which, I mean, is another approach to go, like, especially if you just want to get through the whole thing. Because, for example, in the first portion of the book, one of the most crucial and fundamental aspects of understanding all of the things that were introduced within quantum field theory is the concept of symmetry and symmetry breaking. And even though that concept is very crucial and fundamental, it is also very hard to actually understand what is happening there. And even now, I'm still not 100% comfortable with what the heck is happening with symmetry and symmetry breaking. It's a very abstract notion that I still need to go on to different analogies and potentially maybe even have to go through a little bit of the mathematics in order to become more comfortable with it. My third and last pro of the book has to do with the content within the book itself, and especially the second part of the book, which is the part about the experiments that were involved and such. I found that part to be quite captivating, as a lot of times some of the popular science books tend to just stay into the theoretical lane to kind of explain the fascination and the you could say the reasons as to why this thing is so groundbreaking and important as to like our understanding of the universe and such. A reason why I pointed to my The Elegant Universe by Brian Greene book, because that book is in essence what made me really fascinated by that aspect of physics. But I found this book to be a similar type of thing, but more, I would say, like I said earlier, like a more adult or a more like scientifically mature take of things like that, because it actually shows like the development and how people came to actually discover these subatomic particles, these things which gradually build up the foundations of the standard model of particle physics. It showed that these things did not fall out of nothing, and that even though we cannot see, well, these subatomic particles because they're ridiculously small, there's very clever engineering and instrumentation being done in order to make these experiments more viable, in order to peer into these fundamental aspects of physics, and also doing so while ruling out error, which is an extreme challenge that was posed for many teams in for many of the teams that were doing these experiments. And especially I like that it shows that it wasn't just, for example, CERN that was working towards the discovery of the Higgs particle, but there were all other like labs and such that were being built as well, and in the hopes to basically reach the high energy collisions that were needed in order to see certain traits and signs of physics either beyond the standard model or traits of the Higgs boson, such as, for example, Fermilabs and the SSC collider that was planned to be built like under the soil of Texas, if I'm not mistaken, but that essentially it lost funding when the President Ronald Reagan, I think, lost the election. But I found that aspect to be very fascinating and very human, especially as a lot of times these physicists in both Europe and the US had to justify the reason for the government to be spending such a ridiculous amount of money in building these large experiments, since you would indeed beg to question why would one spend so much money if the thing is very abstract and doesn't deliver any, you could say, social impact. And it's only so long that you can get away with the argument of, oh, there are discoveries that have been made like indirectly due to these scientific contributions. There needs to be something more, and that something more is explored in this book, and I like that quite a bit. So in that regard, my third last pro is that just the content alone of that second portion of the book and the first portion, the theoretical aspect, is also it's super fascinating, especially if you're someone that really likes theoretical physics and thinking about quantum field theory and how these things sort of build up on each other, and also shows you a little bit of the competitive natures of academics and how they try to race to publish things beforehand, etc. If you're interested in things like that, then I'm pretty sure you'd enjoy well, both portions, both the first and the second portion of the book. Now, before I just ramble on for a couple of 10 more minutes, let's dive into my only con with this book, and that is that the book, well, for me, this is not necessarily a big con, but I can see that being a con for a lot of other people. The book is not written for everyone. The audience, I feel like for this book, is specifically people that are very much enthusiastic about physics and have done a little bit of background, we could say, research or studying of physics in their free time. Like they're really passionate. You might be someone that likes to listen to physics podcast, or you've read other books on the topic that are not like very surface level but that dive into a little bit of depth, or you might be even be a student of physics or a student physics alumni, and that made you basically comfortable with the topic, because otherwise I can see this being a very daunting read, especially the first portion of this book, which is the more theoretical portion of the whole story, the whole narrative. The second portion of the book, the part about the experiments, I think is a little bit more readable. It's a little bit more digestible for your everyday layperson. But the first portion, which I think is crucial to understanding the second portion to a lot of regards as well. The first portion, that is the theoretical portion, that is quite challenging to go through, even with some physics background, because if you're not someone that's into particle physics, it takes a little bit of time to get used to all of the funny names and all of the weird concepts that are being introduced, of the things basically involving quantum mechanics, which you would guess that it's quite weird. That is in essence no joke. It takes a little bit of digesting, but I do think that if you are willing to put in the time to read the book, go through that, and if you're confused about something, go search up a YouTube video on the particular thing you're confused about or Google it. I think it's very much worthwhile to read, and if you're someone like me in the position that you're curious as to what area of physics you find the most fascinating, or you just want to satisfy your overall curiosity, and you don't know what the heck is going on with particle physics because it's this such a weird, bizarre, abstract field, pun intended, with so many funny particle names and things happening. I think this book will give you a much needed introduction to particle physics and make you definitely think of, like, oh, does this sound like something that I'd be interested in? Or does this sound like it sounds, well, not for you, basically. This book is an excellent orientation, I'd say, to knowing whether or not you seriously find particle physics fascinating, because even though there are again a lot of other pop science books out there, like by authors like Michio Kaku, Sean Carroll, by Brian Greene, etc., I haven't read, of course, all of those books, and I've heard great things about some of those books by those authors. But from my experience, from what I've read with The Elegant Universe by Brian Greene and the Hidden Reality, that is also by Brian Greene, I've read portions of that book at least. It's those books are a bit more they're a bit more superficial, and even though The Elegant Universe, I think, again, is good, it's more targeted towards like the advanced high school like student that is really curious about these things, while this book is more for like the mature audience that is seriously interested in developments in physics and you're okay with jargon, basically. So with that being said, I gave this book a 5 out of 5 of Goodreads. I can imagine that you figured that out already, because again, I found this book to be a very entertaining and enthralling read. I did not read such a fun popular science book in such a long while, and I have some other pop science books that I have on my TBR pile to read, like not just physics pop science book, but also things on biology and biochemistry, as I find those fields to be quite fascinating as well. This book made me curious about Jim Baggott's bibliography, and I found some other books that seemed quite interesting to me that I might maybe even buy in the future, such as the books Quantum Space, if I'm not mistaken, that is basically allegedly, I think, like a biography of loop quantum gravity, and showing how that theory came to be in a very similar fashion to this book as well, like showing the developments of the theory, and doing so because I think the author thinks that string theory is quite overhyped, which I am sadly starting to agree with him, that string theory is very pushed out there. And even though loop quantum gravity has a similar problem to string theory, like no empirical, like no way of testing it at the moment, I still think it's important to see these other ideas and not just focus on one thing just because like like media is pushing that one idea forward a lot. So that book seemed quite interesting. It seems quite interesting to me at least. And there's also the book called, I think, Failing from Reality or something along those lines. I write the title there. That is, I think, a book about how a lot of modern theoretical physics research is driving more and more away from actual, like, trying to come up with things that could be tested and looked for in experiments, and are more interested in like theoretical fundamental, like, mathematical underpinnings of nature, or allegedly of nature. It is a book that is very similar in the spirit of the book Lost in Maths by Sabine Hossenfelder, which is another very interesting physicist out there, and even has her own YouTube channel, which I highly recommend you checking if you have the time. She's a very non BS type of person that is very skeptical about certain claims and is very critical. And I highly recommend you check it out if you're interested in physics. And the book that I mentioned by Jim Baggott right there is a book of a similar spirit to Lost in Maths, from what I heard at least. And that is basically him critiquing certain modern ideas, such as, again, string theory, M theory, the holographic principle, so things such as ADS, CFT correspondence, etc., and to their viability as to how many things they help us to model in the actual real world. I'm finding his books to be quite interesting, and I hope to read at least one of them again. So I hope you guys enjoy my book review for Higgs by Jim Baggott. I certainly really enjoyed the read, more so than I thought I would initially. And if you guys have any book recommendations like that, please feel free to share them down below. I'm more than curious. And yes, feel free to leave a comment, like, subscribe again if you're curious. And I hope to see you guys again very, very soon. Cheers and bye.